that we need a couple of explanations about terminology. And I wanted to say that I'm going to get to that in a second, but I am a fourth generation Japanese American that's called Yonsei, Ichi, ni, san, shi, go. And my grandparents, as Reverend Chad talked about this morning, all of my grandparents were born in Hawaii. And as US citizens, they owned farmland in the Imperial Valley in California. Yet my family was taken from their home in 1942 to Poston, Arizona. My oldest sister was born there. I've made myself familiar with our history, and yet I was amazed at the length to which the US military would go to prove that the Issei's should be rounded up. They lied to each other, they lied to the government, and they lied to the Supreme Court, all to prove that we were a military risk and threat to the US and our neighbors. During this panel discussion, you'll learn some of the intergenerational impacts of incarceration from 3 descendants of the camps. Our panelists will share their stories, and I'll tell you, they are riveting. Some of them that we've never heard before. And then the Reverend Chad Tanaka-Pak will also share some insights into incarcerated versus non-incarcerated individuals, and some current events that are happening today, and why we should all be aware and concerned about them. So, I don't know how my slides got so messed up, but definitions. I said Issei's are the first generation that came to the US. Nisei, second generation. Sansei, third generation. Yonsei, fourth generation, like me. And fifth generation is called Gosei. There's been some confusion about the terms internment and incarceration. And internment historically refers to the detention of enemy aliens, citizens of a country with which the US is at war. During World War II, this technically applied to Japanese, German, and Italian nationals. Incarceration, on the other hand, refers to being imprisoned behind bars or jails. Nisei were US citizens, so technically their experience was incarceration. It's an important distinction to make. Also, Executive Order 9066. This is the order that allowed for the mass incarceration of Japanese on the West Coast. And the lies and the deceit by the US government that I refer to were based on false charges of sabotage, espionage, and spying. Reports of clandestine activity along the California coast at night were well documented and well investigated by the Office of Navy Intelligence, the FBI, and the FCC. Their investigation showed that these activities were not sabotage or espionage, but simply day-to-day normal activities of farmers and residents. The ship-to-shore communications were fabricated completely by the government. But all of that information was not included in what is called the final report written by the Western Defense Command of the Army to the Department of War. Instead, it said that we posed a military threat. So, prior to Pearl Harbor, Issei were prohibited by law from becoming citizens. Many had been in the US for decades, had put down roots and raised families, and yet there was no chance for citizenship for them. And of course, non-citizens could not own land, so they had to lease land to farm or to open a shop. They had only limited leasing of 3 years, but then in 1920, leasing was banned completely. And the Issei could not own their own land in their children's names. Their children, remember, are the Niseis, who are US citizens now. Still, the Issei and Nisei were very, very successful at farming, particularly in California. So there was plenty of hatred against Japanese on the West Coast, driven by economic and power struggles. The heightened fear and hysteria from Pearl Harbor only magnified the distrust and success of successful Japanese farmers and fishermen. The Alien Enemies Act allows the US president to detain foreign nationals during wartime. It was used in 1941 to arrest enemy aliens, non-citizens, the Issei, and they were seen as subjects of the Empire of Japan. 17,000 Isseis were arrested immediately after Pearl Harbor. Community leaders, Buddhist priests, businessmen, language teachers, all of them rounded up by the FBI and put into detention facilities where, of course, they had no legal representation or due process. Many of them were not reunited with their families until their families were sent to the permanent camps that were set up. You'll hear some more about this from our panelists. The Enemy Aliens Act was also used to round up the Japanese American citizens, like my grandparents and my dad and my mom and their siblings. The Wartime Relocation Authority built 10 camps that were spread across the US, sometimes in the most desolate of places, like Manzanar, Poston, or Gila River. Plus, there were dozens of other DOJ and immigration and naturalization detention and isolation centers. An interesting factoid, 1,862 people died in the camps, including my maternal grandmother. I never met her. And almost 6,000 babies were born, yay! Including Barney Sasaki on our panel, my sister Dale Cole, and my best family friend Karen Shea. The total number of people incarcerated was about 125,000. You'll see most of the literature says 120,000, but we've located about 5,000 more names. And like I said, 17,000 of them were Issei. About 80,000 were Japanese American citizens, or Nisei, or Sansei. That comprised 2/3 of the total number of incarcerees. And Californians made up the vast majority of 98,000. I'm going to attempt to talk about revealing the Berne order. It's complicated because there's a final report, there's a final draft report, there's a final report, and there's a published report. But basically what it is is that in 1942, the War Department felt that they probably need to get something in writing about why the exclusion and evacuation programs were instituted. So they ordered a report be written. A report was written, and they expected it to have espionage risk from the Japanese, racial ties and dual loyalty of the Issei, and time constraints, which prevented them to provide due process. Instead, the original draft report said that there was no military necessity for incarceration. And the removal was based only on racial traits. So when the assistant director of the War Authority got a hold of this draft report, he was incensed, as you can imagine, and he ordered the report altered to remove the words about lack of military necessity and racial profiling. He ordered them altered, and he said that all copies of this report must be burned. So the authors went ahead and started altering the report, and once it was altered, they did burn all of the reports, including notes and correspondence. But then miraculously, the original hand-amended report was found in the bowels of the National Archives. It included notes, delete this, all of this marginalia, and they knew they had found what was called the smoking gun. It led to proof that Isseis and Japanese Americans were incarcerated illegally, not for military need, but because of their race. This revelation, of course, led to a floodgate of activity to right the wrongs against the Japanese during World War II. President Gerald Ford in 1976 rescinded Executive Order 9066, saying, quote, "We now know what we should have known then. Not only was that evacuation wrong, but Japanese Americans were and are loyal citizens of America." In 1983, Peter Irons, along with the Asian Law Caucus, presented evidence to the federal court in San Francisco, stating that Korematsu's conviction was based on race alone. Korematsu's conviction was vacated. And the Commission of Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians was formed to investigate legality of the camps. That formed public hearings in 9 cities with over 750 survivors testifying, including our own Vernon Yoshioka. In 1982, a report was written and found no direct military necessity for detention. And instead, it was based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and failure of political leadership. Then in 1987, H.R. 442 was passed by the Congress by Norm Mineta as the pro tem Speaker of the House. It called for the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which included a formal apology to incarcerees, a $20,000 reparation to surviving incarcerees, which began in 1990, and which totaled approximately $1.6 billion. It was estimated that $1.6 billion, which much less than half the estimated total value of property and and income that was lost. And importantly, it was the first time that our government paid for violation of civil rights against a group. And now, today, as Kay has reminded me many times, we are repeating our history. It began in, well, I don't know when it began, but in January of 2017, Executive Order 13769 was passed or issued, which banned Muslims from entering our country. And again in 2025, the ban was extended to include 39 countries where nobody could enter, from which nobody could enter the US. Very disturbingly, there is also a push for erasure of our history and culture. Executive Order number 14253 is called Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. What it is against, quote unquote, divisive ideology. But what it really means is suppression of the narratives about slavery, segregation, and systemic racism, including erasure of what happened to the Japanese during World War II. That good old Alien Enemies Act came up again last year, used against the Tren de Aragua. They were accused of invading the US, and therefore people from Argentina were prevented from coming into the country. I'm very happy to say that there are groups working to ban the Alien Enemies Act. I'm not quite sure what the correct word is, but the JACL has filed a lawsuit. JACL is a Japanese American Citizens League, which has been a political organization for decades and decades, far before World War II. They have put forth a lawsuit asking that the judiciary look at balance between the Supreme Court and the executive branch. And Darren Tashima, the son of our members, Judy and Ron Tashima, works for the firm of Covington and Burling, which is a firm that originally supported Korematsu in court. Their son was elected, I guess, to accept the pro bono award from the Asian Law Caucus for their amicus brief that was submitted in support of the JACL. So there are a lot of things being done, but not enough. And I want to now introduce, before I finish my talk, I want to introduce Reverend Chad Tanaka-Pak. I have your bio here somewhere. I promise I did. I don't know where it is. Here it is. If you weren't here this morning, you weren't able to hear his wonderful sermon on telling stories and the importance of that. Reverend Chad Tanaka-Pak is an associate conference minister for Building the Future at our Southern California and Nevada Conference of the UCC. His work is focused on stewardship, financial stability, and legacy planning. And Reverend Chad had a very interesting degree before he went into the Divinity School of Yale. He was a vice president at Goldman Sachs in New York and was very involved in the Wall Street. Reverend Chad was born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, is a Yonsei of Japanese and Korean heritage, and he has served several faith-based organizations committed to racial justice and LGBTQ equality. So please help me welcome Reverend Chad.
Okay, got it. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to be with you. As Nancy mentioned, I am Chad Tanaka Pak, and I am Yonsei. So all 8 of my great-grandparents came over to Hawaii to work on the sugarcane and pineapple plantations in the early 1900s. 4 of my ancestors were Japanese Americans. And so my family history includes my great-grandfather, who was interned in Hawaii during World War II. I'd like to share with you in my time a look at internment and incarceration and comparing the experience of Japanese Americans in Hawaii. Oh, I was told I need to speak closer to the microphone. Comparing the experience of people in Hawaii versus California. I'd like to also share, how many of you have listened to the podcast? Okay, a lot. That's great. So as you were going through the podcast, if you're like me, there were light bulbs that went on like, oh, this is what's going on today. So I'd like to share with you some of my observations as I listened to the podcast of themes in U.S. history. Some of them are actual intentional themes that are woven into the DNA of the U.S., and some of them are less themes and more questions of, what are the parallels between now and then? So I'll spend some time just naming a few of these, and I'd love to hear from you all as well what other ideas you might have as you listen to the podcast. And then finally, I'd like to offer some framework to take action. And I'm going to offer a framework that's a little bit different from what you might be used to hearing. Okay, I'm watching the time. So, and then before I launch, I just want to name, I am a Christian minister. I'm ordained in the United Church of Christ. And as a Christian minister, I also name that my ancestry includes Buddhists. All of the Tanakas and the Katos, who were my grandmother's ancestors, were Buddhists, and they were very devout. My father was actually studying to be a Buddhist priest. And so as a Christian minister, I do not believe that Jesus Christ is the only path to God. I also believe that there are many paths to God, and you do not need to believe in any God in order to fully participate as a human being in this amazing, mystical universe that we call home. So let's talk about Hawaii versus California. My great-grandfather, Seigoro Tanaka, was one of 2,000 people of Japanese descent who did spend time in detention because of his suspected disloyalty. And you'll hear this from the other panelists as well. This project that Nancy has inspired, this journey that we've been inspired to go on, inspired me to dig more deeply into my family's history, and I'm still learning. But what I have learned about the 2,000 people who were interned or incarcerated in Hawaii, my great-grandfather was living on Maui, and he owned 3 fishing boats. And fishing was a prohibited activity. So because of that, he was incarcerated for the duration of the war. I'm still trying to figure out where he was incarcerated, but I believe he remained in Hawaii. So let's look at some reasons why incarceration and internment in Hawaii was different than what happened here in California and the rest of the mainland on the West Coast. And before we launch into some ideas, I think it's helpful to name that the whole premise of interning and incarcerating Japanese Americans in California, it was pretty flimsy to begin with. And that becomes clear when you listen to the podcast. And so I think it's helpful to flip it and say that California and the West Coast was actually the exception to the rule. That's why it didn't happen in Hawaii, because the people in Hawaii said, this makes no sense. So before we go into detailed explanations, I want to offer that, name the elephant in the room. So the differences were due to a variety of reasons. There was not one reason. Nancy already talked about a few of them. Part of it was social. Japanese Americans made up 37% of the population in Hawaii. And so that meant other people of other ethnic and racial backgrounds, they had a lot of interaction and relationship with people of Japanese American descent. They did not view their neighbors as threats or criminals. And a lot of them could distinguish, based on mannerisms and cultural norms, who the Issei were from who the Nisei were. Like, a lot of us can do that, and in Hawaii, a lot of people could do that for Japanese Americans, and actually probably people of many different ethnic backgrounds. So that was social. Another was political. So Hawaii was under military rule during World War II. So there were all these additional requirements that were going on in society that applied to the entire community. And I actually remember my Korean American grandmother talking about curfew and lights out. And if you did have your lights on, you have to pull the shades down. So that applied to everyone. And because Hawaii was under martial law, that meant that Japanese Americans were not in particular a particular threat, because everyone had to get a background check. Everyone had to walk around with their IDs. So that was another component, was political. So that included, I saw a question mark, IDs, there was a curfew, blackouts, and then certain things were censored in society. And then a third one out of many different varieties were economic. As I mentioned, Japanese Americans were 37% of the population. If the federal government moved them off the islands, they would have no labor force to actually do the economy and support the war. And so part of it was practical and economic. I want to just share with you quickly, so I grew up in Hawaii, and when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, our governor was Japanese American, our senators were our US representatives. As I went through school, my high school principal was Japanese American. In high school, our chaplains were Japanese American. So I just grew up assuming that that was the Japanese American experience across the US. No. I've only been in California for 5 years, and I was invited to guest preach at a historically Japanese American congregation in LA County for 3 weeks. And I got there and had this idea, but I went in with the idea of Japanese Americans in Hawaii who have a certain access to economic means, and that also relates to how they carry themselves in society. And as soon as I entered the Japanese American congregation here in California, I could feel the difference. This was just a few years ago, it was maybe 5 years ago, and I could feel the generational impact that the internment and incarceration had on the people in the pews. It was a deeply spiritual thing, and it was very humbling to realize the impact of this thing that feels like faraway history for some of us. I'm Generation X, I'm in my 50s. It feels a little far away for some of us, and yet the impact is real. Want to talk briefly about themes, then versus now, and thankfully Nancy named the specific ways in which particular executive orders and laws are being used today, and wanted to just name some themes. And actually Nancy named some of these themes as well. One theme, making up stories about people to portray them as criminals, to create fear, and to justify inhuman policies. We see that clearly then, and I don't have to go into detail when I say that you know that this is going on today in the US. Another theme, individuals in power, usually in the government, who do not have the courage to speak up. Byrne Order names US Attorney General Francis Biddle and California Governor Earl Warren, who then, and it also documents their regret and their apologies to processes. But the fact is, those two men, those individuals, had the power to call this all off, and they didn't. So think about our current government and the things that are going on, especially on the federal level, and how many people in power are not using their voice to name what is obviously not right. That's another theme. I don't know why that is. That would be a good discussion. Another theme, race and citizenship. Citizenship is not colorblind, and we see that from the beginning of our nation's history with the formation of the Constitution, where Native Americans were not allowed to be citizens. And then as African Americans, Black Americans, were assigned this totally irrational value of being 3/5 of a human being. That is in our Constitution. So what we experienced during World War II with the taking of US citizens and pulling them apart specifically because of their race, that wasn't new. That is woven into the DNA of our country. And we see that going on today, as Nancy pointed out. Here are some things that are less about themes that go through the US and more about questions. Byrne Order made it very clear to me that the internment experience was really focused on California. And it made me think about the ICE raids that happened, and at least the initial ICE raids were really focused on California. What is it about our identity as Californians that make us a special interest and focus of the federal government going on in Washington, D.C.? That's just a question I have. Other questions, where is the money? So the podcast makes it very clear that a lot of the reason why internment and incarceration happened in California was because of business interests, the farmers, as Nancy mentioned. Well, if you do a quick Google search of the ICE detention centers that are primarily being run by private enterprises, where is the money? Again, I don't think it's a direct parallel, but it's worthy to ask the question, what are the economic reasons why this has happened? Follow the money. And then, yeah, let's stop there. There are others, but in terms of time, let's keep moving. So I wanted to end with some thoughts on action. How can we take action today? And there are a whole host of very practical things you can do. There are amazing groups in the communities, in various communities here in San Diego, in Los Angeles. You can get connected with them. But I'd like to offer us a different way to think about action. And that is, do we have what we need to take action? And that means physically, emotionally, spiritually, do we have what we need? Because let's be real, when we read the news, doesn't a bit of our soul feel like it's being sucked out of us? How can we remain strong so that we can not only remain resilient within our own life, because we have our own life to live, but also then to reach out and take action on behalf of others? So I'd like to offer some thoughts about what it might look like to be physically, emotionally, spiritually resilient. Because, folks, this journey is going to be long, and we need stamina. So, some ideas, and different people have different approaches to this. Some people talk about a lens of restoration and repair. Some people talk about a lens of storytelling. Some people talk about joy as resistance. I like that one. Some people talk about the need for rest in order to continue and do this work. I'd like to offer a new one, and that is curiosity. Be curious. That the podcast shows the benefits of being curious. By people asking questions, answers were discovered that were very surprising. And I like the lens of curiosity because it means two things. One, you're willing to ask a question about the status quo. You're not willing to just accept the status quo for what it is. Be curious. And the other reason why I like curiosity is that I think it leads very nicely to action. Because once you start exploring answers to your questions, the actions will reveal themselves. It will be kind of obvious. So as you move forward, here are some takeaways. One, start asking questions. Some of you are naturally curious, that comes to you, which is great, so like you might have to restrict the number of questions you're asking. But some of us aren't. I really did not grow up very curious because I grew up in a very like ABC kind of household because I was taught curiosity killed the cat, right? Or children should be seen and not heard, right? And so some of us have been acculturated not to be curious. And if that is you, I encourage you, this is your invitation, start to be curious. Start asking questions. And then find others who are asking the same questions as you are. So it's not only about you, now we're reaching out. For us introverts, that requires energy. Reach out and start talking to people and say, hey, I have this question about blah. And it doesn't have to be so specifically justice-oriented, right? I was driving in Los Angeles County yesterday, and I saw something that said, H&L Tooth Company. What is I don't know. So I'm going to start researching that, and who knows where that leads, right? So just allow yourself to be free and ask questions. What is H&L Tooth Company? Because I'm sure there's a story there, right? Ask questions. Connect with others, and when you connect with others, it's going to require trust. Trust me, the course of action will reveal itself. The course of action will reveal itself. Unless the course of action is to have a meeting and a committee about it, that's not the point. There are other contexts where you can have as many meetings as you want, but when you are asking questions with a partner or with a group of people, open your heart and you will see that the answer on how to act will become clear. Trust me, trust me, trust me. Okay, those were my thoughts. Thank you, and thank you, Nancy.
I was a teacher. That was great. Yeah. Yes, thank you so much, Reverend Chad. Wow. Teachers give feedback, right? And Nancy, I want to say I've seen several iterations of her presentation, so I learned again so much. Thank you. Oh, hi, Linda. My task now is to introduce our panelists. So I, number one, invite you to the stage, please. Come on up. Okay. And our panelists are all friends and family with Nancy and most of us, so we know them, but I would like to share brief biographies from them. Biographies. I'm just so off-center today. Deborah, I'm going to start within the center. Deborah Kodama. She's a native San Diegan, born to Kathy and Ben Sagawa. In the very early, she says, she adds this, in the very early 50s.
No, 60s. 60s. Oh, don't make me that old. Good God.
Thank goodness she has a microphone. Okay. Yes, thank you, Deborah. And many of us in historical society certainly remember Ben Sagawa as being a founding member. She's been married to Ken Kodama, an El Centro native, since 1985, and together they have 2 children, Jillian and Garrett, who both also live in the San Diego area. Deborah has 3 older brothers, Mike, who lives in Washington with his wife Mary, Randy, who lives in Sacramento, and Eric, a resident of the Bay Area. Deborah and Ken both come from a very large extended families, since their fathers each had 9 siblings. Okay. As a matter of fact, she and Nancy Shimamoto are related. It's a small world, right? Nancy's grandfather on her mother's side and Deborah's grandmother on her mother's side were first cousins. She's a communications professional specializing in corporate internal communications, employee engagement, and organizational change management. She works for General Atomics as an organizational optimization and communications project manager. Like her father, Deborah is a past president. We should have a past presidents club, because I think there are a few others here.
I think that'll be me and Yuri.
Of the Japanese American Historical Society of San Diego, having served on the board for many, many years. She is also a member of Pioneer Ocean View United Church of Christ and is currently the chair of the Church and Clergy Relations Committee. So thank you, Deborah, for being here.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Certainly. And to my left is Julie Lynn. Julie is a Sansei who was born and raised in San Jose, California. Her mother was one of 10 kids. These are large families. Grew up on a farm, this is making more sense, in San Jose. Her father was one of 6 kids who grew up in Berkeley. And Julie has one brother who lives with his wife in San Rafael. Julie attended UC Davis and later met her husband, Jim, we all know Jim, in 1988. They were married in 1990 and have 2 grown daughters and 1 son-in-law now. Julie has had careers in technology and education, but is now retired. In retirement, she keeps busy by volunteering at church, being part of Toastmasters, which is terrific. She studies Spanish, plays music, and works at Staying Fit. She and her husband love the outdoors and traveling both within the U.S. and abroad. And if they're anywhere near an internment site, they always make a point to stop and visit that. So thank you, Julie. Thanks for being here. And next, third, is our panelist, Yasushi Bernard Sasaki, better known as Barney Sasaki. And Barney was born in 1943 at the WRA camp, concentration camp in Jerome, Arkansas. In May 1944, the Jerome camp was closed and his family was moved to the Gila River camp. That was in Arizona. In May of 45, as the camps were closing, the family seized the opportunity to find work and housing at Seabrook Farms in New Jersey. Okay? Frozen food, Seabrook, okay. Barney attended school there and went on to graduate from the University of Delaware in 1965 with an AB in mathematics. An interesting side note he provided, he was a classmate of Joe Biden. We'll all ask you about that. Okay. Barney's career involved active duty and reserve in the U.S. Navy, work as a computer programmer, systems analyst at IBM, and later at Sperry Univac and Verifone, Inc. He married a California girl, Karen Sue Okazaki, in 1976. And Karen, being a California girl, could only endure one cold winter in Alexandria, Virginia. They moved back to California. After 44 years together, Karen passed away in 2020. So currently, Barney lives at the Glen at Scripps Ranch and enjoys many movement and exercise classes. Very smart, including line dancing, Zumba, step classes, and Tai Chi, amongst others. He also enjoys the many, many diverse people in his Glen community. So thank you, Barney, for being here today. And bringing Nancy back to moderate this panel.
Thank you, Kay. I just have to switch out some paperwork, and then I'm going to come sit next to Barney. Okay. you. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Barney is a very interesting man. He's got a very interesting story. So, Barney was born in Jerome, Arkansas, and doesn't have any memories of that for some reason.
No.
So tell us about your story.
Okay, I have no memories of camp, but I know the family timeline from the executive order when it was signed. My family lived in Florin, California. My parents had 5 children in 1942, and my mother was 7 months pregnant. They took my father away because he was an Issei. He went to Hawaii on the island of Maui in 1913 to work on the sugarcane fields, but he wasn't getting paid the same as the men, and he thought that was unfair, so he went to school at Lahaina Luna in Maui, and he met a teacher there who convinced him to go to college on the mainland. So he did. He ended up in Park College in Missouri, outside of Kansas City, and he's one of the few Isseis from that period who has a college degree. But it didn't help him find a job. So he moved back to California. My mother was a picture bride. She was a Nisei, born in Florin, California, but went back to Japan with her family. And she was anxious to get back to California. So, sight unseen, a man 15 years her senior, she married him and had 6 children. I was number 6, and I was the only one born in camp in a hospital. All my other siblings were midwifed. But from Jerome, when they closed the camp, we went to Gila River, and my mother was the main person who had to pack up and travel with the children. And from Gila in 1945, we went to Seabrook Farms. They recruited a lot of the incarcerees from all 10 camps to work in Seabrook. And
Excuse me, but is that the same as the Bird's Eye brand of frozen vegetables?
Clarence Birdseye and Charles Seabrook
Okay,
were
thank you.
instrumental in the frozen foods processing. So with the promise of housing, there was an elementary school right in Seabrook, and incarcerees from all 10 camps settled there. At the peak, there were 2,500 Japanese citizens who lived in Seabrook. And almost overnight, the school roll call changed from Jones and Smith and Jackson and Johnson to Sakamoto, Sasaki, Ichinaga, and so I have to hand it to the teachers. They did a great job. They didn't stumble on any of the names. But what I remember from going to school in Seabrook, there were so many other Japanese kids that I was not the only one in my class that was Asian. I had 6 or 7 or other Japanese classmates, so I never felt isolated or picked on or bullied because there were too many of us. But if you talk to any of the children that went to Seabrook from the camps, they have fond memories of Seabrook because we didn't have to suffer the pressures that our parents did in moving and what was going to happen next.
So you were in Seabrook from the time you were a baby,
Yes,
and you went all the way through high school
yes.
in Seabrook. Okay. And your high school days, you played sports?
I played tennis, intramural basketball, baseball. I played Little League Baseball and Babe Ruth League Baseball. So we had our parents stressed upon us to be good Americans. And I think one of the reasons our family went to the Christian church instead of the Buddhist church was because she wanted us to assimilate more easily into the mainstream population. And I can tell you, our school day started with the Pledge of Allegiance, in which they added the term under God while I was there. We had a Bible verse from the Old Testament and the Lord's Prayer that was recited every day.
Wow.
So I think it was a wise decision to grow up
Yeah.
in a Christian church.
My parents did the same thing. They converted to Buddhism, and I was raised as a Christian. So when we were chatting the other day, Barney, you said that you always felt like you were accepted until you went to the University of Delaware.
Yeah, once I graduated from high school, and there were so many Japanese kids around, I went to college at the University of Delaware, which there was one other Asian girl in my freshman class. And I really felt isolated for the first time because I had no support group. And it really hit home freshman year during fraternity rush. A lot of the dorm members and I went to all the various fraternities, and I had a call from one of the ATO brothers who happened to be from my hometown in Bridgeton, went to the same high school. And he was the one chosen to tell me that I could not become a member because it was a white Christian organization. So that opened my eyes.
Okay. We're almost out of time, but do you want to share about, the people would ask you, well, Barney, where are you from?
Yes, I always relished that because I would first say, oh, New Jersey. And they said, oh, no, where are you really from? And I said, oh, I was born in Arkansas. And it went on for several iterations until I knew they were looking for my ancestry, and I said Japanese.
But at that time, they also had never heard of the incarceration
Oh, no,
camps.
no. Even at Delaware, one of my classmates called me a liar because he said that could never happen. It's unconstitutional. And so I had to tell him I have the birth certificate that shows I was born in Arkansas.
All right. Barney, thank you.
Pass the mic.
Thank you for sharing your story. To Julie. Unfortunately, Barney has told me he has absolutely no recollection of his childhood in Jerome, Arkansas, or Gila River until he got to Seabrook. He really didn't have any memories. So thank you for sharing. Julie Sano Lin,
Yes, I'm ready.
tell us about your first memories of hearing about camps.
Oh, I remember this very distinctly. I was about 16 years old, and I had gotten a job at Yosemite. We lived in San Jose, so to drive from San Jose to Yosemite was about a 3.5 or 4 hour drive. I was sitting in the car with only my father, and somehow we got on the subject of family pictures, and my dad said, we don't have very many family pictures from when I was growing up. I said, why? And he said, because we had to turn in our cameras during the internment. I said, how weird. I've never heard of anything like that. We had to, he said we had to turn our cameras in to the Berkeley Police Department. Well, that made me so mad because the nerve of the Berkeley Police Department to take my, parents' camera away. And so I thought, I'm going to write to the Berkeley Police Department and tell them to return this camera. But it turned out to be a much bigger story than just the camera, which I found out on our 3-hour drive up to Yosemite. That was my first time I'd ever heard of the internment. I never read about it in school. None of my relatives talked about it. So it was a big eye-opener for me.
And where did your dad go?
So
at
my
first?
dad and his family went to Topaz, Utah.
Okay.
And at that time, my dad was about 15 years old. My grandfather, who immigrated from Japan, he had been in this country already for 38 years. So in 38 years, you can do a lot to establish yourself. He had a job. They had a home in Berkeley that was purchased under the name of my uncle, my dad's brother, because they weren't allowed to own property themselves. But they built a whole community. And their community was unique because in Berkeley, they were pretty much redlined in this one area. All the Japanese families were living in this certain area. In fact, they have a map that shows where the Japanese families lived. And on my dad's block alone, there were 16 Japanese American families. And that, I think, really benefited my father in and his community from coming back after the internment and resettling and just relying on each other for support. They belonged to a Christian church, and this church was very, very helpful to them in storing their belongings and renting out their house so they didn't lose their home.
Right.
But I think that played a really big part in how my father experienced the internment.
And what about your mom?
My mom's story was completely different. She was from a family of 10 kids. They lived on a farm, and they weren't able to, I'd say they were pretty isolated, even though there were other Japanese American families living in San Jose, but they lost their farm, had to start over after the internment, which wasn't easy. But one of my cousins told me a story about how my grandmother, she had brought some cherished items over from Japan. She brought some kind of bookcase or kind of cabinet, a special comb, things like that, that rather than sell those items, which they had to sell all their other farm equipment, their house, everything they had, but she refused to sell those particular items because they were so dear to her heart that she burned them instead. She chose to burn those items. So there were many people who had to do the same thing or chose to do the same thing rather than sell their cherished items for pennies.
How do you think the incarceration affected your mother and her sisters and family?
I think I'm almost willing to say that my mother really never got over the internment. I think she really went out of her way to be as American as possible, to the point of pronouncing, our name was Sano. That's how you pronounce it, sort of with a Japanese interpretation of it. She decided at one point in her life she was not going to go by Sano anymore. She was going to go by Sano because it sounded much more Americanized. She raised my brother and I to be very Americanized. We moved into an all-white neighborhood. The only Japanese people that I pretty much knew when I was growing up were my relatives. I would say that it was really an eye-opener when I went to my high school reunion, because I was thinking that I was the only Japanese-American person in my high school. But I go to look at my yearbook before I go to the reunion, and I was like, what? There were other Japanese-Americans in my high school, but they were invisible to me because my mom was so bent on becoming or being as American as possible that she really actually discouraged us from kind of hanging around with Japanese Americans because she didn't want us to be targeted. She thought that if we hung around, I remember her saying this to me, if you hang around too many Japanese Americans, I'm worried you're going to develop an accent. What accent that was, I'm not really sure. But this was a fear of hers. So she wanted us to be as American as possible.
And how do you think that has affected your life?
I think the internment experience, my mother's internment experience, by the way, my mother's internment experience was played out much differently than my father's. They ended up getting divorced because their viewpoint was so different. My father continued to be very much involved in the Japanese community, joined the Japanese American Church, went to the Topaz reunions, and it's been a source of enrichment in his life, I think, to be Japanese American. I don't think my mother really realized that until much, much later in her life and really appreciated the fact that she was Japanese American. Like, for example, we rarely ate Japanese American food at home. But here I am in this half Japanese American church, tons of Japanese American friends, and loving every minute of it. And that happened when I was in college because somebody across from me in the dorm kept inviting me, come on, you gotta go with us, you gotta go with us. Who was Japanese American. I was like, I don't wanna hang out with you guys, but she was persistent, and I'm so glad. I have to really thank her for introducing me to really my heritage. So.
Wow. Well, it sounds like you learned a lot about yourself before that. Also.
I did, yeah. And this opportunity to explore my heritage as well as my family's internment experience for the second time has been, I have to say, one of the most enriching experiences I've had lately. I've dug into my past. I've talked to relatives. I've been able to piece together how I ended up to be the person I am from exploring this history.
Wow. I'm glad that you feel it was a worthwhile.
It was wonderful.
Trek.
Twist my arm anytime, Nancy.
Thank you so much, Julie.
Well, thank you.
Okay. Deb, cousin
Yes.
Deb.
Cousin Nancy. And many of you here are cousins, I think.
How's it going?
Great.
Good.
How much time do you want me to fill?
I want you to tell us a little bit about your dad, what he did here in San Diego before he was taken away, and about his parents, because I don't really know very much about his dad.
Gotcha. So my dad, like me, born and raised in San Diego. He was a Nisei, as opposed to my mother, who was Sansei. Her parents were born on the Big Island. But my dad was child number 6 of 10. His family were farmers down in the Tijuana River Valley before the war. And so his life was filled with, being a farm kid. He was pretty lucky if his parents remembered his name, because he was kid number 6, and frankly not very useful at that age. He couldn't really help on the farm a lot, right? So, but I think it was a difficult life because they were dirt poor farmers, but there were also lots of other Japanese families farming down there at the time. The Iguchis were there, the Itamis were there. I want to say the Owashis were there, but I'm not quite positive. But there were lots of other Japanese American families in the area.
Mm-hmm. And how old was he when he went to camp?
My dad was 11 at the time, 1942. 2. Yeah, he turned 12 in June of that year, but he was 11 when they went off to camp. And so his memories of camp, I think, are different than a lot of other people who maybe were older at the time when they went to camp. And it's funny that I use that terminology because growing up, that's how my parents described their incarceration. They called it camp. And I think if you ask most any other Nisei who's still alive and had that experience, they call it camp. They don't call it, sometimes internment, they never call it incarceration, but it was usually camp.
Right. Even I don't think the Iseis called it incarceration.
No, because that would have meant that they were criminals somehow, right? And then they weren't.
Right.
The crime was being born of Japanese descent. But because my dad was younger, he was, middle school age, he kind of talked fondly, I got to be honest, talked kind of fondly about those years when they didn't have responsibilities. He didn't have any responsibilities on the farm, so he made a lot of lifelong friends there. He lived, they were in Poston. They were in Poston Camp 3. They lived on the last block of Camp 3, Block 30, so they were Barracks 330. Down that way also lived the Himaka family. I think the Yanagiharas lived down there. So my father made friends there that he kept for the next 70 years of his life until he died. And they did shenanigans like most 10, 11, 12-year-old boys do. And you got to start with when my dad went to camp, as you probably know, you were allowed one suitcase. You could basically take what you could carry. So he's an 11-year-old kid. He doesn't know where they're going or for how long. He's just a kid. So he talked about stuffing his suitcase full of bubble gum, his baseball mitt. I think he took some comic books because you're left to your own devices. What else are you going to pack? So that's what he took. But in camp, one of his most fondest memories was building stilts because he and his buddies figured out that the women's showers had very high walls with open windows at the top. And so these geniuses found wood around camp, build stilts to kind of just play and walk along the women's showers because you're 12-year-old boys.
I have never heard that story.
Yeah. My dad loved to tell that story.
I just wanted to say one thing about Poston. It was the largest
Yes.
camp of all 10. And I think it was 3 miles from one end to the other. And my parents were in camp number 1. They did not go to Santa Anita or to any other holding center. They went directly from Imperial Valley to the camp.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
And then most of the San Diegans went to Santa Anita.
Santa Anita first, and then Camp 3, most of San Diego, except for my mother. My mother ended up in Camp 1, even though she lived in San Diego. My mother's mother had training as what they called a practical nurse in those days. And so she thought if she volunteered to help in the camp hospital, they might get preferential treatment. No, they just got sent earlier, which meant she ended up in Camp 1, not knowing any other people there, when the rest of San Diego pretty much ended up in Camp 3 in Poston.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We are almost at our closing time, but I wanted to say that, as I mentioned, we're going to go over to Fellowship Hall. And if you have questions for this great panel that we organized today, please save them and talk to them when we go over for tea and senbei, okay? Thank you so much, Barney, Deb, and Julie. Wow, I can't believe it's only 5 after 2. I thought I was going to go so long with everything, and I'm very glad that we are on time. Isaac, can you pull up slide number 14 for me, please? So Reverend Chad had some really great ideas. Very deep thinking man you are. Here's my list, okay? I was just trying to think of something that we could do, that we could all do. And I think one of the most important things is for us all to get out and vote. We don't want to say who to vote for, how to vote, but go out and make your vote count, please. There is a No Kings March that I think is scheduled for July 4th. Haven't heard a whole bunch about it yet. But I also provided a list of nonprofits, and it's in the fellowship hall. And it's Japanese and Japanese American nonprofits that do a lot of really good work on this field. And also some nonprofits that are supporting the people who are in detention right now. And our Pastor Mary Sue is involved in it and has been to the courthouses and been to Otay Mesa detention camp. So there are ways that we can do something. There are ways that you can reach out to your representatives in Congress and your senators. All of them will write back to you with a very nice little form letter and tell you what they're doing for us. That's just not a lot, but if you really get into a conversation with them, they will correspond with you and try to figure out what it is that you want them to do. The other thing that I got was something very sweet from one of our members here at POV. And she said, I just want people to be kind. Even if you have to be kind to somebody you don't like, try to be kind and pass that kindness along. And then the other thing that I remembered from one of Mary Sue's sermons was that she said, nobody can do everything, but everyone can do something. A little small thing. And it does make a difference. If people are happy and feeling good about themselves because you've been kind to them, maybe they go off and make a better life for all of us in that way. So I want to say thank you to so many people who made this day possible. Our panel, Barney Sasaki, Julie Lin, Deb Kodama, of course, Reverend Chad Tanaka Pak, and Ayumi Kawano from Kiku.org was the one that did our beautiful flyer that we sent around. And also Kiku.org was very instrumental in helping us. Sam Mills from JAH-SSD and our Emily May-Humed from POV's office were very, very helpful. Of course, I want to thank Reverend Mary Sue Brookshire for everything she does for our community, and all of the POV volunteers standing in the back of the room and behind the AV. Thank you so much, and thank you all on Zoom for being here. I know there's a lot of you out there, and I really want to express my appreciation for showing up today. And of course, everybody in person. You've all been a great group, and I appreciate it very much. Mark. No. I think this is a picture from Poston. Teachers with young students. Yeah. And there's also a picture in the fellowship hall. Our church, Ocean View, goes back to 1907. And it was the San Diego first congregational Japanese church, or some jumbling of that. And there's an album that has pictures, and there's a picture on an easel that has the reverend at that time, whose name was Reverend Kikuchi, the people from San Diego, from his church, this Ocean View Church at the time, were sent to Poston, and they are all standing or sitting with Reverend Kikuchi in Poston, where they started worshiping again. It's a powerful picture. Take a look at it. So I invite you, please join us in Fellowship Hall, have some water, tea, and some cookies, and talk to our panelists. Yes, Linda.
We want to thank you, Leonie, so we know how much time and effort you have put into making this.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you. I see people around our community, they say, where have you been for the last 2 weeks? Thank you. Please join us over there in Fellowship Hall.